If you've ever watched Breaking Bad or perhaps something on HBO, then you'll probably be well versed in the concept of the anti-hero, figures like Breaking Bad's Walter White, Sopranos, Tony Soprano, The Wire's Omar Little, or perhaps Enoch Thompson, as portrayed by Steve Buscemi on Boardwalk Empire. These are figures who are technically the heroes of the story, but who also display characteristics which could easily make them villains of the same story if it was told from another angle. History is full of such figures, and the names on today's list have been chosen precisely because the names were at some point portrayed from a very unflattering, if not villainous angle. In some cases, this was during their lives, and in others, after. Some had their reputations later amended, being today seen in a much more favourable and different light. Some didn't, in fact, and the case could be made, even today they actually deserved the criticism they got. Perhaps just not quite to the same extent that they got it. We'll leave that up to you. Let's jump in. Socrates. Okay, so right off the bat, we'll begin with someone who probably wasn't ever really universally reviled per se. Instead, ancient Greek philosopher Socrates was more kind of disliked, but to be disliked in ancient Greece could be a bit of a dangerous game, hence the reason his name features in today's video. That's not to say that Socrates also didn't have a large share of admirers during his lifetime. I mean, he had plenty, especially among the Athenian elite, as well as his students like Plato and Xenophon. But some Athenian elites absolutely despised him because he always was questioning social values and traditional authority. What a dick. His standing amongst the elites also took a blow because of the Peloponnesian War with Sparta, during which one of Socrates' associates defected and fought against Athens, and another one became part of an emergency government and proved to be an absolute and complete tyrant. But it was arguably the Athenian public who disliked Socrates the most, for humiliating them in public debates, for making fun of religion, and for being just a bit of an oddball who wandered about barefoot, seeming to be above wealth and social status, and lecturing people instead of doing something productive, like getting a f***ing job. And where the elites and the commoners' dislike united was on Socrates' lukewarm attitude towards an idea that had recently become rather vogue: democracy. You see, Socrates lived in the 5th century BCE, not long after the Athenians became the first to introduce democracy by way of male citizens' involvement in electoral voting, jury duty, public debate, and policy decisions. And this was all very exciting for the common folk whose opinions were hardly listened to by most hierarchies in the period before or after. But while democracy had many advocates, Socrates wasn't one of them. He was skeptical of the common masses' ability to make wise decisions, theorizing that most people acted out of ignorance or self-interest, not rational thought. As he often made clear, he didn't care for the everyday Athenians' opinions, which he compared to a ship being navigated by its passengers rather than a trained figurehead with the ability to actually steer the thing. Shockingly, Socrates' belief that his fellow citizens were basically too stupid to wield democracy won him few friends, and his list of critics began to proliferate. Alright, but unpopularity is not the same thing as being hated, is it, Simon? So, what, might you ask, qualifies Socrates to feature on a list of the most reviled people if he wasn't necessarily reviled himself during his lifetime? Well, unfortunately, his unpopularity was enough to see him executed at age 71 in the year 399 BCE. Socrates' demise began when 3 citizens brought a criminal case against him for impiety and corruption of the youth. The aging philosopher was brought to trial, something which in ancient Athens was conducted by a jury of citizens, about 500 of them no less. True to form, Socrates didn't really defend himself, since he believed that to do so was beneath him, and instead he preached even more to the assembly, declaring, as later described by Plato, quote, "I will never stop practicing philosophy or exhorting you to care for virtue." He told the jury that he was a gadfly sent by the gods to awaken Athens from moral sleep, that silencing him would harm the city, but not him personally, and that if he were freed on condition that he stop questioning people, he would refuse. None of this exactly helped his case, did it? And he was found guilty on both charges by a margin of about 280 to 220. One could speculate that if it just hit pause on the pontification for the duration of the trial, he might have swayed enough of the jurors to defeat prosecution and let him live to meet the gods on his own terms. But he didn't, and since the prosecutors had asked for death, that's what the gadfly ended up getting. And just for good measure, Socrates managed to make extra certain of his own fate. He apparently approached his guilty verdict prior to sentencing with levity, remarking that he should be actually rewarded with free meals for life for benefiting Athens. More seriously, he proposed paying his dues by way of a small fine, which, given the seriousness of the charges brought against him, did nothing but piss the jury off even more. So the jury made a counter-proposal of death, on which the vote went much more strongly against Socrates than before, this time around 364, 140 against. And his fate, with that, was sealed. Socrates spent a month in prison before his execution, during which time fellow philosophers like Plato and Crito begged him to escape and even arranged a plan for him to do so. But Socrates nobly refused, arguing that by escaping he would undermine the rule of Athenian law, which he had, until then, lived under all his life. When the day came, Socrates drank a cup of poison hemlock and died, surrounded by his friends and students. His last words were to Crito, declaring, "Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. See that it is paid." Pretty soon afterwards, Socrates' reputation underwent a dramatic transformation. Many Athenians began to feel that sentencing their most influential thinker to death for being a pain in the arse was a bit excessive, and he was soon seen as a martyr who died for conscience rather than yielding to public opinion. Moreover, not long after, one of Socrates' accusers, Anytus, a local politician, was actually convicted of corruption and bundled off into exile. But Socrates' true rise to superstardom came in the following decades as Plato's dialogues were published, which cast his erstwhile teacher as a philosophical saint and a man utterly devoted to reason, virtue, and the pursuit of truth. One after the other, various philosophical schools began to herald Socrates as a master of thought. Xenophon, like Plato, cast Socrates centrally in his highly influential works Memorabilia and Symposium. The Cynics admired Socrates' simplicity and independence for material needs. And the Stoics revered him as the embodiment of reason and virtue under pressure. In the following centuries, Socrates became more or less seen as the ideal philosopher. Romans like Cicero and Seneca held him as reference for their ideas of moral philosophy, and even early Christians saw parallels between Socrates and Jesus, both unjustly condemned, both dying calmly for truth and virtue. Later, Socrates became central to the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, and is today held as the founding figure of Western philosophy. Quite the redemption arc there, Socrates. Chaim Rumkowski. Okay, next up is a controversial one, which was and continues to be the subject of some serious historical debate. So strap in, because this might just be the most convoluted case of them all. This man is Chaim Mordecai Rumkowski, a figure seen by many as having sold out his fellow Jews in the Litzmannstadt ghetto to the Nazis during the course of World War II. Now, this is a man whose vilification cannot in any way be contested. While someone like Socrates was disliked by those around him for being stuffy and irritating, the hatred of Rumkowski's own community towards him came for reasons that were, and are, mostly entirely valid. Let's discuss what he got up to. Rumkowski was a minor Jewish community leader in pre-war Poland and ran an orphanage in the city of Lodz. Like the rest of his community in 1940, he wound up in the city's Nazi-established ghetto, the Litzmannstadt ghetto, its name stemming from the German for Lodz. The ghetto's Nazi overseers picked Rumkowski to be the so-called elder of the Jews, a kind of puppet dictator under German supervision. He reported directly to the authorities, but had control over things like food distribution, housing, labor assignments, and even internal policing through the so-called Judenrat. Rumkowski set about his role with zeal, exercising a governing style that was self-righteous and authoritarian. He had postage stamps and other documents printed with his image and title, and demanded complete obedience from his already suffering co-religionists. He built a cult personality, referring to himself as a paternal protector of the ghetto, and even came up with a kind of informal currency referred to as Rumki or Heimki, which he ordered ghetto residents to exchange all other currencies in their possession for. Rather than a primus inter pares among Jews in the ghetto, Rumkowski became a sort of primus inter inferiores and was mockingly referred to as King Chaim by the community. The Jews of the ghetto were soon pretty damn sick of him, and even riskily carried out strikes and demonstrations against his heavy-handed rule between 1940 and 1941. Rumkowski played an active hand in the deportation of some Jews from the ghetto, thus actively sealing their fate in the camps which awaited them. He was also accused of being a sexual deviant with an unhealthy interest in young children, with rumors swirling also about his administration of the Lodz orphanage before the war came to Poland in 1939. But Rumkowski's undoubted piece de resistance, perhaps his most famous and harrowing act of all, was an infamous speech he delivered in the ghetto on September 4th, 1942. In what is known today as the Give Me Your Children speech, Rumkowski told the assembled Jews, quote, "The Germans are asking us to give up the best we possess, the children and the elderly. I was unworthy of having a child of my own, so I gave the best years of my life to children. I've lived and breathed with children. I never imagined I would be forced to deliver this sacrifice to the altar with my own hands. In my old age, I must stretch out my hands and beg. Brothers and sisters, hand them over to me. Fathers and mothers, give me your children." Eventually, the bell tolled for Rumkowski, as it did for the other Jews of Lodz. The ghetto was liquidated in the summer of 1944, and Rumkowski arrived on one of the last transports to Auschwitz, where he was reportedly beaten to death. There are contrasting accounts of how he died. Some claim other Jews from Lodz set upon him once the doors of the wagon car opened, while others claimed it was the Sonderkommando who got him, symbolically battering him in front of the doors of the gas chambers. His fate was ultimately unknown, but few of the Jews who survived Auschwitz would have shed a tear for their community's great betrayer and tormentor. So, now you're obviously wondering, how on earth was he unfairly reviled given all of that shit? Well, some historians have pointed out that the actions of Rumkowski must be understood in the context of the time. He may have been a brute, but he was also charged with some of the most impossible decisions perhaps ever to be made by a single person, and had never exactly chosen to be in the role in the first place. Rumkowski seemed to believe that by making the Jews economically indispensable to the Germans through labor, the community might be spared destruction. As such, he relentlessly bullied the community into toiling on behalf of the Nazis. Unfortunately, his aims also meant having to give up some members of the community too, this probably being the powerless puppet's only leverage before the Nazis, not least an order that Rumkowski was in no position to try and refuse. In the years since, a furious debate has raged as to whether Rumkowski's actions, such as asking Jewish parents to literally give up their children to be gassed, was all pragmatic, or whether there was a degree of self-service in what he did. Judenrat scholar and author Isaiah Trunk called his actions tragic, but understandable, in such a mercilessly coercive system. Hannah Arendt, on the other hand, saw him as little more than a symbol of moral collapse under Nazi domination. Many of the ghetto survivors echoed her sentiments and pointed to the case of Adam Cernokow, the equivalent head of the Warsaw Ghetto, who committed suicide as soon as mass extermination began in 1942, rather than give up his kin to the slaughter. But perhaps it's unfair to compare either one to the other. The motivations, the information available to both men, perhaps even their beliefs and assessments of the situation were quite different. It's almost impossible to fully know. What we do know is that the Lodz ghetto under Rumkowski was the last to be liquidated by the Nazis more than 2 years after the Warsaw Ghetto, and at a time when the Soviets had already advanced to within pre-war Polish borders. Israeli professor and Holocaust historian Yehuda Bar noted that if the Russians had continued their summer offensive in 1944, they might have actually reached Lodz, then one of the westernmost cities in Poland, before the ghetto was liquidated, and if they had, its ghetto may have been one of the only ones to be liberated, with a large number of the inhabitants still alive. If that happens, Rumkowski might have been remembered very differently to what ultimately became his legacy. Moreover, and as mentioned, there were survivor testimonies and rumors after the war that Rumkowski had sexually abused young girls in the ghetto or in his orphanage, but these were not substantiated by documentary evidence and are considered unproven by historians. Given the depth of Rumkowski's unpopularity, it is likely that few would have defended him when such rumors started flying in the ghetto, which could perhaps explain their proliferation. The case of Rumkowski is undoubtedly one of the war's greatest quagmires. Was he as much a villain as he's been depicted? But on the question of how to deal with Nazi bloodlust without raising suspicions or being shunted onto the coal fires himself, our next entry is a man whose story shared some similarities with Rumkowski's, but with a very different climax and an even more vastly different epilogue. Oskar Schindler. Right, so sticking with another World War II entry, the name Oskar Schindler is one obviously much more well-known than Chaim Rumkowski, and while Schindler wasn't really reviled in the pantomime villain-like way that the head of Lodz Jewish Council was, his own post-war experience was very far removed from immediate and universal praise. And that might surprise you. You could say, Simon, everyone knows about the heroism of Schindler. We've seen Schindler's List. We know about the Jews he saved from a certain death in Nazi death camps. So, to feature him on this list, it makes no sense at all. Well, yeah, but Schindler's actions weren't really known about until long after the war had ended, beginning in 1982 when Thomas Kenneally's book Schindler's Ark was published, and much more widely after Steven Spielberg's film Schindler's List was released in 1993. By then, Schindler was nearly 20 years dead, and so his selfless humanitarianism wasn't heralded during his lifetime except by the estimated 1,200 Jews whose lives he endeavored to save. Schindler wasn't the only Holocaust hero to not be immediately remembered for his exploits, by the way. Sir Nicholas Winton was another, a British man who helped bring 669 Jewish children from Czechoslovakia to the UK on the eve of World War II, saving them from an almost certain fate in the concentration camps. Winton, too, received little acclaim after the war, and his story was only broadcast to the world for the first time in 1988 during an endearing live segment on the British television show That's Life. But there were a couple of key differences between the cases of Schindler and Winton. For one, Winton had obviously never been a member of the Nazi Party. Schindler had, having joined shortly after Germany annexed his native Sudetenland in 1938. It was this membership which allowed him to be in a position to save Jews once the final solution went into effect. But when the war ended, Schindler was a war profiteer tied, through membership, to one of the most brutal entities to have ever existed. He had actually even been accused of spying for the Nazi Abwehr on the eve of the war while still a citizen of Czechoslovakia, and for which he was charged with subversion by the Czechoslovak authorities in 1938. Lucky for him, he was released in September after the Munich Agreement went into effect and the legal process against him fell apart. In short, by the end of the war, Schindler was a known former spy and member of a seditious minority blamed for turning their backs on their country by siding with the Reich. These weren't really inaccurate assessments either. Schindler had indeed been a member of the Nazi Party and remained so from 1939 until the end of the war in 1945. He'd indeed been arrested and arraigned for treason, and had indeed seen his enamelware business blossom by way of supporting the Nazi war effort. And the German population of the Sudetenland had indeed sought unification with the Reich at a time when Winton was already busy beginning his plans to rescue children in the same territory from doom. So in 1945, Schindler found himself in danger of being arrested as a war criminal and fled Czechoslovakia for Germany and later to Argentina, where he tried to reinvent himself as a chicken farmer. But one business after another failed, and he arrived back in Germany in 1958. In the meantime, Schindler's marriage had failed. He declared bankruptcy in 1963, and he narrowly survived a heart attack the following year. He lived on until 1974, when he died near pettiness of liver failure in the West German town of Hildesheim. While it is perhaps inaccurate to say Schindler was reviled in later life, he did carry with him the stigma of all that was mentioned before. For the most part, his story was just unknown at a time when the world was still coming to grips with the scale and the horrors of the war, and little space was yet available to recognize the individuals who'd helped to mitigate it. By the 1960s, Schindler did start to be recognized for his exploits, having a tree in his honor on Israel's Avenue of the Righteous in 1962 and receiving several state honors, including the German Order of Merit in 1966. But the recognition didn't convert into any kind of economic comfort, and he lived largely off the donations of the people he'd saved, many of whom now lived in Israel, the US, or other parts of the world. But those people never forgot about him. Poldek Pfefferberg moved to the United States after the war and immediately set about trying to get a movie made about Schindler to bring his story to light. A deal with MGM was signed in 1951, but the film wasn't made, and Schindler quickly squandered the $20,000 advance he received for having his story depicted. Pfefferberg continued living in the US, and by 1980 was running a leather goods store in Beverly Hills when Australian writer Thomas Kenneally wandered in. Within 2 years, Kenneally had converted Pfefferberg's story of his wartime experience into the novel Schindler's Ark, which became a bestseller and won the Booker Prize. 11 years later, the book became the basis for Schindler's List, one of the most successful movies of all time. That was when the story of Schindler's life truly came to the fore, an immoral businessman who discovered his humanity in the worst circumstances and moved mountains to save the Jews he employed, retrospectively known as the Schinderjuden, from being deported. He did so even as his business faltered, and he racked up an estimated $1 million in costs, including bribes and black market goods, to keep his cause alive. Schindler has become a household name and was recognized as righteous among the nations by Israel in 1993. He's buried on Mount Zion in Israel, the only former member of the Nazi Party to be honored that way. But all of this didn't stop him from living out the rest of his life in uncertainty and relative financial peril. Oscar Wilde. My wallpaper and I are fighting a duel to the death. One or the other of us has to go. These words, draped in the characteristic wit for which Irish writer Oscar Wilde was renowned, were reportedly spoken from his deathbed as he ailed, impoverished, in a decrepit Parisian hotel room. He died impoverished soon after from suspected bacterial meningitis at the age of 46. Wilde's health had been withering for years and had never quite physically recovered from a grueling 2-year sentence of hard labour a few years before. Much like British mathematician Alan Turing, his conviction was tied to something that stopped being a crime a few decades later, but certainly was at the time, and helped crumble his once grand public reputation into dust. Wilde was homosexual, a fact revealed to the world in a very public and very inglorious manner. Oscar Wilde was born in Dublin in 1854 to an upper-middle-class Anglo-Irish family. He studied at Trinity College, Dublin, then Magdalen College, Oxford, where he became known for his wit and flamboyant personality. He became a leading figure in what was known as the aesthetic movement, promoting art for art's sake. He was a celebrated playwright and also wrote the landmark philosophical novel The Picture of Dorian Gray, depicting the corruption of the soul through the pursuit of pleasure and beauty without moral restraint. But while living as a successful playwright in London, Wilde became the lover of Lord Alfred Bosie Douglas, a British aristocrat 16 years his junior. Theirs was an intellectually imbalanced romance, with the much younger Bosie routinely messing up translation tasks that Wilde had given him. But Bosie could rely on the financial support of his father, the powerful John Douglas, 9th Marquis of Queensberry, a man best known for helping to standardise the rules for boxing, today known as the Queensberry Rules. Douglas Sr. was also well known for being a bit of a brute, and he had no love for his son and Wilde's questionable relationship whatsoever. The Marquis decided to challenge Wilde at the Albemarle, a private members' club in London's upscale Mayfair district, which the playwright was known to frequent. Having been turned away by a porter, Douglas left a note for Wilde in the lobby, little more than a scribbled message, in which he succeeded in misspelling the word sodomite. But Wilde got the gist, and outraged, he very unwisely decided to take the Marquis to court for libel. Of course, the resulting trial led to scrutiny of the nature of Wilde and Bosie's relationship, and with that, the case for libel fell apart. The case was judged that the accusation be true in substance and fact, and Wilde was forced to pay the Marquis's legal costs, which bankrupted him. Worse, the prosecution saw an opportunity and countersued the playwright for gross indecency. In the course of his trial, Wilde's reputation was torn to shreds by the press, causing him to remark, "In the old days, men had the rack. Now, they have the press." He was convicted and sentenced to 5 years hard labour to be served at Reading Jail, later HM Prison Reading. Following his release after 2 years, Wilde was rejected by the lofty high society to which he'd previously belonged, and with his career in tatters, Wilde moved to Paris, where he eked out an existence as a penniless writer under a pseudonym, Sebastian Melmoth. Worse, prison had taken its toll on his physical health. The gangly aristocrat had proved no fit for the grueling conditions, where typical duties involved walking for hours on large mechanized treadmills, unraveling old ropes, and carrying and breaking stones into gravel for roadwork. One day, he fell while carrying a heavy load, striking his head and injuring his right ear. The wound never properly healed, eventually developing into a chronic middle ear infection and later meningitis, a dangerous inflammation of the membranes around the brain. In 1900, Wilde's impoverished conditions caused the infection to worsen, and he died within months. Bosie's reputation also suffered in the wake of the trial. He was furiously cut off by his father and also rejected by high society. 2 years after Wilde's death, Bosie married the poet Olive Custance, who, ironically, was in a relationship with a female writer at the time they met. He became a Catholic and an ardent anti-Semite, publishing a pamphlet entitled The Jewish Problem in 1920, which damaged his reputation even further. He also repudiated the relationship with Wilde, and in a bizarre full-circle moment became a notorious litigant, constantly suing people in civil or criminal trials for things they wrote about him and his infamous relationship. Unfortunately, Bosie was himself sued for libel by none other than Winston Churchill in 1923, after he accused Churchill of falsifying a naval report to benefit Jewish stock market speculators. He was sentenced to 6 months in prison, after which, again ironically, his stance on his former relationship with Wilde softened. It probably also helped that by now Wilde's reputation had recovered. 2 years after his death, Wilde's landmark play, The Importance of Being Earnest, returned to the stage at the St. James in London, and by the 1930s it was held as one of the greats of English comedy. By the mid-century, Wilde was seen as a tragic hero of art and individuality, and his life became a symbol of Victorian hypocrisy and the endurance of creative genius. Today, Oscar Wilde is celebrated not only as one of the great stylists of English literature, but also as an early icon of queer identity. Emile Zola. And so for the final entry in today's video, we turn our attention to celebrated French novelist Émile Zola, a man who happened to share a lot in common with his contemporary Oscar Wilde. You see, at a similar time to when Wilde's fall from grace saw him move to Paris, where he died in obscurity, another figure was making the journey in the opposite direction for similar reasons. Zola, the prolific author of various political novels and a central figure of the school of naturalism, had written a newspaper article that was so scandalous that he was forced to flee France for his life, albeit an article on which he was later proven absolutely right. Have you ever heard of the Dreyfus Affair? Well, you see, in 1894, a time of both military hostility between France and Germany and rising anti-Semitism in Europe, French Jewish army captain Alfred Dreyfus was accused of passing military secrets to the Germans. The evidence against him was scant, just a handwritten note found by a cleaner at the German embassy in Paris which offered to sell information to the Germans about French artillery plans. A list of possible culprits was quickly thrown together based on who could have access to such military intel. Dreyfus, being Jewish, was picked as the fall guy despite the evidence against him being weak to, well, just non-existent. He was swiftly convicted in a secret military trial, publicly humiliated by being stripped of his rank, and sent to Devil's Island, a remote prison in French Guiana. Dreyfus languished in prison for the following few years, and while he did so, it became pretty clear that another officer, Major Ferdinand Walsh in Esterhazy, was the real culprit. The army, keen to avoid embarrassment, dismissed the new information and even sent the military intelligence serviceman who made the revelation out of sight to Tunisia. Soon after, an ex-lover of Esterhazy came forward to reveal his declared hatred of France and contempt for the army. And yet the army still refused to reverse Dreyfus's conviction, and he continued to languish in French Guiana for almost 5 years. Given the mistrust of Jews at the time, public media was no friend to Dreyfus. During his trial, nationalist press portrayed him as guilty without hesitation, repeating rumors using headlines like "The Traitor Dreyfus" or "Jewish Treachery in the Army." Once he'd been convicted, the media moved to relative silence, killing the momentum of the case despite the obvious unfairness of what had transpired. It was around this time that Wilde, himself on trial in London, uttered his poignant line about the modern man being tried in the press, not on the rack, something curiously fitting in the case of Alfred Dreyfus. But not everyone took part in the hate campaign. Some so-called Dreyfusards went against the current, and Emile Zola was one of them. In January 1898, he published one of the most famous opinion pieces in history on the front page of the socialist newspaper L'Aurore, in which he lambasted the anti-Semitic miscarriage of justice against Dreyfus. In what is today famously known as J'accuse, or the I accuse letter, he obliged the President of France to confront the corruption and prejudice at the heart of the nation's institutions and listed by name senior officials he held responsible for framing Dreyfus. Zola's piece sent shockwaves through French society, which at that time remained bitterly divided between the Dreyfusards and the anti-Dreyfusards, especially with Esterhazy having recently gone on trial, where he was acquitted. Zola's searing piece lent huge weight to Dreyfus's defense, given his status as a towering man of letters. The problem, though, was that not everyone wanted to hear it. After the letter was published, crowds rioted in the streets, and newspapers across France published furious counterattacks and refutations. Zola was attacked by nationalists and conservatives and accused of betraying the army and the nation. In another curious parallel with Wilde, he was charged with criminal libel for defaming the army and somehow found guilty. He was sentenced to a year in prison and issued a hefty fine of 3,000 francs. To avoid imprisonment, Zola fled to England in July 1898 and lived in London under an assumed name for nearly a year. Alfred Dreyfus eventually had his conviction quashed in 1906, 12 years after first being arraigned. He went on to serve honorably in the First World War, during which he was promoted and received the Croix de Guerre medal. He died in 1935 and was buried with full military honors, including a cortege through Paris's Place de la Concorde. But Zola didn't live to see his rehabilitation. He died in 1902 of accidental carbon monoxide poisoning at his home in Paris, where he'd returned having been pardoned, but still branded a traitor and awaiting full vindication for his stand on the Dreyfus Affair. At the time of his death, he'd been nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature for the second time, but it would take another 4 years for Dreyfus to be finally absolved of any wrongdoing by the French Supreme Court and for Zola's defense to be proven accurate. And when he died, it was believed by many that Zola's establishment enemies, of whom there were plenty, had poisoned him. Others claimed he had committed suicide, having realized Dreyfus's guilt and being consumed by shame for defending a traitor. Much later in 1953, a dying Parisian pharmacist claimed his neighbor, a chimney sweep and rabid anti-drey facade, had deliberately blocked Zola's chimney the night before his death, although this was never proven. Either way, just as Wilde's name was later lifted from scandal, so too was Zola's. In 1908, his ashes were transferred to the Pantheon in Paris, France's temple to its greatest citizens, with state honors and an absolved Dreyfus among the mourners. Today, Zola is remembered not only as one of France's most important novelists, but as a moral authority whose writing helped confront injustice and prejudice. Both he and Wilde were condemned by their societies, and in death became symbols of endurance against the hypocrisy of their time. Thank you for watching.